This is the story of the prophet and the whispering silence, a narrative retelling of Elijah's journey from the fire of Mount Carmel to the cave at Mount Horeb based on 1 Kings 18:19. Part 1. The iron prophecy sky over Israel was not blue, it was the color of heated brass. For 3.5 years, the clouds had been locked tight, a celestial vault refusing to yield a single drop of dew. The earth was a mosaic of cracked clay, and the brook Chariot, where the ravens had once brought bread to the man of God, was nothing more than a memory of damp stones. Elijah the Tishbite stood on the jagged spine of Mount Carmel. He was a man who looked like the desert itself, hair wild and wind-whipped, skin leathered by the sun, wrapped in a mantle of sheepskin. Opposite him stood the 450 prophets of Baal, resplendent in their fine robes, smelling of imported oils, and the frantic sweat of those who serve a silent God. How long will you waver between two opinions? Elijah's voice cut through the dry heat like a scythe. The gathered crowd of Israelites remained silent. They were hedge bettors, waiting to see which god held the keys to the rain. The challenge was simple: 2 altars, 2 bulls, but no matches. The God who answered by fire would be the God of Israel. From morning until noon, the prophets of Baal danced. They shrieked, they cut themselves with swords, they leapt upon their altar until the wood groaned. The sun reached its zenith, baking the mountain, but the bull on their altar remained raw and cold. Elijah leaned against a rock, a glint of holy mischief in his eyes. "Shout louder," he mocked. "Perhaps your God is daydreaming. Or maybe he's on a journey, or peradventure he is sleeping and must be awakened." By evening, the prophets of Baal were a bloody, exhausted mess. Not a spark had fallen. Part 2. The descent of fire. Elias stood up. His humor vanished, replaced by a gravity that seemed to pull at the very air. "Come near to me," he told the people. He didn't use the grand, ready-made altar of the state religion. Instead, he took 12 stones, one for each tribe of a fractured nation, and rebuilt the old, broken altar of the Lord. He dug a trench around it, laid the wood, and placed the bull. Then he did something that seemed like madness in a land dying of thirst. "Fill 4 jars with water," he commanded, "and pour it on the offering." They did it. "Do it a second time." They did it. A third time, the water ran down, soaking the meat, drenching the wood, and filling the trench until the altar was an island in a miniature lake. Elijah stepped forward. He didn't scream. He didn't cut himself. He simply prayed a prayer of 63 words. "Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant." He hadn't even finished the sentence when the sky ripped open. It wasn't rain, not yet. It was a pillar of white-hot fire that slammed into the mountain with the force of a falling star. In a blinding flash, the fire consumed the bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and licked up every drop of water in the trench. The people fell on their faces, the sound of their knees hitting the dirt echoing like thunder. "The Lord, He is God," they roared. "The Lord, He is God." By sunset, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. Elijah crouched on the peak, his head between his knees, listening. Far off, over the great sea, a cloud the size of a man's hand appeared. Within the hour, the heavens grew black with wind, and the 3-year curse broke in a horizontal sheet of rain. Elijah, fueled by a supernatural adrenaline, tucked his cloak into his belt and outran the king's chariot all the way to the gates of Jezreel. He was a hero. He was the victor. He was invincible, or so he thought. Part 3. The shadow of the juniper victory at Carmel lasted exactly until the next morning. Queen Jezebel, hearing of the death of her prophets, sent a messenger to Elijah with a vow. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." It is one of the great mysteries of the human soul how a man who stood unmoved before 400 assassins could be broken by a single sentence. The adrenaline vanished. The spiritual high collapsed into a vacuum of terror. Elijah ran. He didn't just run from the queen. He ran from his calling, his God, and himself. He fled south, past the borders of Judah, into the absolute emptiness of the wilderness. He left his servant behind, wanting only the company of his own despair. He collapsed under a solitary juniper tree, its thin shade offering little comfort from the blistering waste. "It is enough," he whispered to the shimmering heat. "Now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." He fell into the heavy, rhythmic sleep of the clinically depressed. He wanted to die in his sleep, to let the sand reclaim him. But the God of the fire is also the God of the feast. A hand touched his shoulder, not a ghost, but an angel. "Arise and eat," the messenger said. Beside Elijah's head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, then sank back into the stupor of his grief. A second time the angel touched him. "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." Strengthened by that mysterious meal, Elijah began a 40-day trek. He wasn't going toward a destination. He was retreating into history. He was going to Horeb, the Mount of God, the same place where Moses had seen the burning bush and received the law. He was going back to the beginning to ask God why the ending felt so wrong. Part 4. The wind, the earthquake, and the firelight found a cave on the mountainside, and huddled in its mouth. The silence of the desert was deafening. Then the word of the Lord came to him, vibrating in the very marrow of his bones. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah had his speech ready. It was a speech of self-pity and perceived isolation. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." God did not argue. He did not point out the miracle at Carmel. Instead, he gave a command: "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." Suddenly, the mountain began to shake. A great and strong wind tore into the peaks, shattering rocks into shrapnel. It was a hurricane of divine proportions, the kind of power that could level cities. Elijah shielded his eyes, expecting to see God in the gale. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake. The foundations of Horeb groaned and buckled. The world seemed to be turning inside out. Elijah gripped the cave walls, waiting for the Creator to speak from the tremors. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire. A roaring inferno swept across the mountainside, reminiscent of the lightning at Carmel. It was magnificent, terrifying, and bright. But the Lord was not in the fire. Then came the silence. It wasn't merely the absence of noise. In the Hebrew, it is called kol mamadaka, still, small voice, or more accurately, the sound of a thin silence. It was a whisper that carried more weight than the hurricane. When Elijah heard it, he didn't stand tall. He wrapped his face in his mantle. He knew that the fire was God's power, but the whisper was God's presence. Part 5. The new commissioned whisper asked the question again. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah gave the same answer, his voice cracking. He still felt alone. He still felt like a failure. But God's response was not a hug. It was a map. "Go," the Lord said. "Return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus." God gave him 3 tasks: to anoint a new king over Syria, a new king over Israel, and most importantly, to anoint a young man named Elisha to succeed him. And the whisper added, a final gentle correction to the prophet's pride: "I have reserved 7,000 in Israel whose knees have not bowed to Baal." Elijah stepped out of the cave. The sun was setting over the Sinai, painting the rocks in shades of violet and gold. He was still tired, and Jezebel was still on her throne, but the vacuum in his chest was gone. He realized that the fire at Carmel was for the people, to show them who God was. But the whisper in the cave was for him, to show him whose he was. He walked down the mountain, a new man. He went to find Elisha, who was plowing in a field with 12 yoke of oxen. When Elijah threw his mantle over the younger man's shoulders, it wasn't just a transfer of power, it was the end of his loneliness. Elijah the Tishbite would eventually leave the earth in a chariot of fire, a fitting exit for a man of such heat and thunder. But as he walked toward Damascus, he didn't look for the fire in the sky. He listened to the rhythm of his own footsteps and the quiet rustle of the wind in the dry grass, knowing that the Almighty was not just in the spectacular, but in the steady, quiet work of a life surrendered. Elijah gripped the cave walls, waiting for the Creator to speak from the tremors. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire. A roaring inferno swept across the mountainside, reminiscent of the lightning at Carmel. It was magnificent, terrifying, and bright. But the Lord was not in the fire. Then came the silence. It wasn't merely the absence of noise. When Elijah heard it, he didn't stand tall. He wrapped his face in his mantle. He knew that the fire was God's power, but the whisper was God's presence. Part 5. The new commissioned whisper asked the question again. What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah gave the same answer, his voice cracking. He still felt alone. He still felt like a failure. But God's response was not a hug. It was a map. Go, the Lord said. Return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. God gave him 3 tasks: to anoint a new king over Syria, a new king over Israel, and most importantly to anoint a young man named Elisha to succeed him. And the whisper added, a final gentle correction to the prophet's pride. I have reserved 7,000 in Israel whose knees have not bowed to Baal. Elijah stepped out of the cave. The sun was setting over the Sinai, painting the rocks in shades of violet and gold. He walked down the mountain, a new man. He went to find Elisha, who was plowing in a field with 12 yoke of oxen. When Elijah threw his mantle over the younger man's shoulders, it wasn't just a transfer of power, it was the end of his loneliness. Elijah the Tishbite would eventually leave the earth in a chariot of fire, a fitting exit for a man of such heat and thunder. But as he walked toward Damascus, he didn't look for the fire in the sky. He listened to the rhythm of his own footsteps and the quiet rustle of the wind in the dry grass, knowing that the Almighty was not just in the spectacular, but in the steady, quiet work of a life surrendered. The years following Mount Horeb were not years of quiet retirement. While Elijah had found his successor in Elisha, the spirit of compromise still rotted the heart of Israel. King Ahab, though he had witnessed the fire of God, remained a man of hollow character, easily molded by the iron will of his wife, Jezebel. In the shadow of the palace at Jezreel lay a lush vineyard belonging to a man named Naboth. Ahab looked upon the vines from his window and craved them not for wine, but for a vegetable garden. He offered to buy it, but Naboth refused. The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors, Naboth said, standing on the ancient principle that the land belonged to God and the family, not the crown. Ahab pouted like a child, lying on his bed and refusing to eat. Jezebel, seeing her husband's weakness, scoffed. Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. I will get you the vineyard. What followed was a masterclass in cold-blooded corruption. Jezebel organized a fast, set Naboth in a place of honor, and then hired sons of Belial, liars, to accuse him of blaspheming God and the king. Under the weight of false testimony, Naboth was dragged outside the city and stoned to death. His blood soaked into the very soil he had tried to protect. Ahab went down to take possession of the vineyard, his heart light with the acquisition. But as he walked between the rows of vines, a shadow fell across the path. Elijah was there. He had appeared as if from the earth itself. Have you found me, O my enemy? Ahab whispered, his voice trembling. I have found you, Elijah replied, because you have sold yourself to do evil. The prophet delivered a terrifying sentence. In the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, they would lick up the blood of Ahab. As for Jezebel, she would be devoured by dogs by the wall of Jezreel. Even the iron-hearted Ahab was broken by this word. He tore his clothes and wore sackcloth, humbling himself. And in the mystery of divine mercy, the whisper Elijah had heard in the cave spoke again, delaying the judgment for a generation. Time passed, and the crown of Israel moved from Ahab to his son, Ahaziah. The son had learned nothing from his father's humility. When Ahaziah fell through the lattice of his upper chamber and lay injured, he did not seek the God who sent the rain. He sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. The angel of the Lord intercepted Elijah. "Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to consult Baal-zebub?" Elijah stopped the king's messengers and sent them back with a grim prognosis. The king would not leave his bed. He would surely die. When Ahaziah heard the description of the man who gave the message, a man with a garment of hair and a leather belt, he knew instantly. "It is Elijah the Tishbite." The king did not repent. He sent an army. A captain of 50 men arrived at the hill where Elijah sat. "Man of God," the captain shouted with the arrogance of the state. The king says, "Come down." Elijah looked at the soldiers. "If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. The sky did not whisper this time. Lightning, precise and terrifying, struck the hillside. In a flash, 51 men were ash. A second captain was sent. He was even more demanding. "Come down quickly." Again the fire fell. 102 soldiers lay dead in the dust. A third captain was dispatched. This man, however, had seen the charred earth. He did not command. He fell on his knees. "Man of God," he pleaded, "let my life and the lives of these 50 servants be precious in your sight." The Lord told Elijah to go. He walked into the king's bedroom, a lion in the den of a dying cub, and repeated the judgment to the king's face. Ahaziah died, just as the word of the Lord had spoken. The air around Elijah began to change. It felt electric, thin, and heavy with the scent of ozone. He knew his time on the dusty roads of Samaria was ending. He set out from Gilgal toward Bethel, then to Jericho, and finally toward the Jordan River. Elisha followed him like a shadow. 3 times Elijah tried to leave him behind, testing his resolve. "Stay here," Elijah said, "for the Lord has sent me on." "As the Lord lives and as you live," Elisha replied, "I will not leave you." They were joined by a company of 50 prophets who watched from a distance. When they reached the banks of the Jordan, the same river that had parted for Joshua centuries before Elijah took his mantle, he rolled it up and struck the water. The river shuddered and divided. The 2 men walked across on dry ground. On the other side, in the wilderness where Moses had died, the atmosphere became unbearable. The sky began to swirl. "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you," Elijah said. Elisha did not ask for wealth or long life. "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so." Suddenly, the sound of a thin silence from Horeb was replaced by a roar. A chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared, cutting through the space between them. A whirlwind of air descended from the heavens. Elijah was swept up. He did not see death. He saw the light of the presence he had served so fiercely. As he rose, his sheepskin mantle, the symbol of his office, his burden, and his authority slipped from his shoulders and fluttered down to the desert floor. Elisha stood alone on the bank of the Jordan. He picked up the mantle. It was heavy, smelling of wood smoke and the wild places. He walked back to the water's edge. The 50 prophets watched from the other side, silent and skeptical. Elisha struck the water with the mantle. "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he cried. The water parted. The age of the fire had ended, and the age of the oil, the age of Elisha's miracles of healing and provision, had begun. But the memory of the Tishbite remained carved into the soul of the nation. He became the prophet of the end, the one who would return to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children. Centuries later, on a different mountain, the Mount of Transfiguration, 3 disciples would see a man whose face shone like the sun. Standing beside him, talking of a new and final exodus, were two figures: Moses, the giver of the law, and Elijah, the restorer of the fire. Elijah's story is not merely one of miracles, but of the terrifying and beautiful reality of a God who speaks in the storm, but lives in the whisper. When Elisha stood at the Jordan with the mantle of his master, he was not a man of the desert like Elijah. Elijah was a storm. Elisha was a rising tide. While Elijah lived in caves, Elisha walked the streets. While Elijah called down fire to destroy, Elisha often worked miracles to restore. His first act in the city of Jericho set the tone for his ministry. The people came to him complaining that while their city was beautiful, the water was bad and the land was unfruitful. Elisha did not pray for a storm. He asked for a new bowl and some salt. He went to the spring, cast the salt in, and declared, "Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water." From that day, the salt of the earth became the sweetener of the life-giving flow. It was a sign. The prophet of the mantle would be a healer of the broken infrastructure of Israel. The miracles of Elisha soon moved from the public springs to the private homes of the desperate. One day, the widow of a member of the company of the prophets came to Elisha in tears. Her husband was dead, and her debts were so great that the creditors were coming to take her 2 sons as slaves. "What do you have in your house?" Elisha asked. "Nothing at all," she sobbed, "except a small jar of olive oil." Elisha gave her a strange command. "Go to all your neighbors. Borrow every empty jar they have. Don't gather just a few." She did as she was told. Behind closed doors, with her sons bringing her the vessels, she began to pour from her tiny jar. The golden oil flowed 1 jar, 2, 10, 50. The small jar never ran dry until the last vessel in the house was full. "Go," Elisha said, "sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on the rest." But Elisha's power reached deeper than poverty. It reached into the grave. In the village of Shunem, a wealthy woman had built a small roof chamber for Elisha, honoring him as a holy man of God. In return, Elisha prophesied that she, though childless and married to an old man, would bear a son. The child grew, but one day in the harvest field, he cried out, "My head! My head," and died in his mother's arms. The woman did not weep, she acted. She saddled a donkey and rode to Mount Carmel to find Elisha. When she caught hold of his feet, Elisha realized the Lord had hidden it from him. He rushed to the house, entered the room where the boy lay cold, and performed a strange, intimate ritual. He lay upon the child, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. The flesh of the child grew warm. Elisha paced the room and did it again. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha had not just predicted life, he had wrestled it back from the shadows. Perhaps the most famous story of this era involves an enemy. Naaman was the commander of the army of Aram, Syria, to Hero, a great man, and a leper. A young Israelite girl, taken captive in a raid, told Naaman's wife about the prophet in Samaria. Naaman, desperate, arrived at Elisha's door with horses, chariots, and a fortune in silver and gold. Elisha didn't even come out to meet him. He sent a messenger. "Go, wash in the Jordan 7 times. Naaman was furious. "I thought he would surely come out, stand, call on the name of the Lord, and wave his hand over the spot." He preferred the mighty rivers of Damascus to the muddy Jordan. But his servants persuaded him. Naaman dipped. Once, twice, 6 times. On the 7th time, he emerged. The white, scaly skin of the leper was gone. His flesh was as soft and clear as the flesh of a little child. He returned to Elisha, offering gifts, but Elisha refused every penny. For Elisha, grace was not for sale, a lesson his servant Gehazi would learn painfully when he tried to secretly take the money and ended up inheriting Naaman's leprosy instead. The king of Aram grew frustrated. Every time he planned a secret ambush against Israel, Elisha warned the king of Israel. "There is a spy among us," the Syrian king roared. "No, my lord," his officers replied. Elisha, the prophet in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. The king of Aram sent a massive army to surround the city of Dothan, where Elisha was staying. In the morning, Elisha's servant went out and saw the city hemmed in by horses and chariots. "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" the servant cried. Elisha smiled, a calm that seemed insane given the circumstances. "Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Then Elisha prayed, "Lord, open his eyes that he may see." The scales fell from the servant's eyes. He looked up, and the hills were not just covered with Syrians, they were covered with horses and chariots of fire surrounding Elisha. The celestial army that had taken Elijah was still there, standing guard over his successor. Despite these wonders, the political world grew darker. A great famine struck Samaria during a Syrian siege. It was so horrific that mothers were bargaining to eat their own children. The king of Israel, in a fit of misplaced rage, blamed Elisha and vowed to take his head. Elisha sat in his house with the elders. When the king's messenger arrived, Elisha made a staggering prophecy. "By this time tomorrow, a seah of the finest flour will sell for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." An officer of the king scoffed. "Even if the Lord made windows in heaven, could this happen?" "You will see it with your own eyes," Elisha said, "but you will not eat any of it." That night, the Lord caused the Syrian army to hear the sound of a great host, chariots and horses, and a massive army. Panic-stricken, believing the Hittites and Egyptians had been hired against them, the Syrians fled, leaving their tents, their horses, and all their food behind. For lepers starving at the city gate decided to surrender to the Syrians rather than die of hunger. When they reached the camp, it was a ghost town filled with a feast. They ate, drank, and then realized, "We are not doing right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves." They alerted the city. The starving people of Samaria trampled the king's skeptical officer in the gate as they rushed out to the food. The prophecy was fulfilled to the letter. There was plenty, but the mocker did not taste it. Elisha lived to be an old man. He saw kings rise and fall, including the bloody coup of Jehu that finally wiped out the house of Ahab and the cult of Baal. But even Elisha eventually succumbed to the illness of which he was to die. King Joash of Israel came to the dying prophet and wept. my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." The same words Elisha had shouted when Elijah was taken. Elisha had one last prophetic act. He told the king to take a bow and arrows and shoot out the window toward the east. "The Lord's arrow of victory," Elisha declared. Then he told the king to strike the ground with the arrows. The king struck 3 times and stopped. Elisha was angry. "You should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have completely destroyed Aram. But now you will defeat them only 3 times. Elisha died and was buried. But the double portion of spirit he had requested from Elijah did not dissipate. A year later, some Israelites were burying a man when they saw a band of Moabite raiders. In their haste, they threw the dead man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched the bones of Elisha, the dead man sprang to life and stood on his feet. Even in the grave, the prophet was a conduit of the resurrection power of God. The story of Elijah and Elisha is the story of a God who refuses to remain silent in an age of idols. From the fire of Carmel to the salt of Jericho, from the chariot of the whirlwind to the dry bones in a tomb, the message remained the same. The Lord, He is God. They left behind a school of prophets, a restored remnant, and a legacy that would point forward for 1,000 years. When a man named John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness wearing a garment of hair and a leather belt, the people didn't ask who he was. They knew. The mantle had returned. To continue this epic saga, we must move beyond the individual prophets and witness the unfolding of the judgment that Elijah and Elisha had foretold. This is the story of the twilight of the northern kingdom, the rise of the terrifying Assyrian shadow, and the final desperate attempts of God to reach a people who had forgotten the still, small voice. The death of Elisha marked the end of an era of visible wonders. The miracle age of the mantle was replaced by the writing age of the prophets. Into the vacuum left by the chariot and the oil came men like Amos and Hosea, men who didn't part rivers, but whose words cut like serrated knives. Israel, under King Jeroboam II, had grown fat and wealthy. They had expanded their borders and built summer houses and ivory houses. They thought God was pleased with them because their economy was booming. But Amos, a simple shepherd from Tekoa, walked into the royal sanctuary at Bethel and leveled a terrifying charge. You sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. You trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground. The fire of Carmel had been about who to worship. The message of the later prophets was about how that worship must change one's heart. The people were still bringing sacrifices, but their hands were stained with the blood of the oppressed. During this same period, a strange footnote in the prophetic line emerged. Jonah, a prophet who had served during the expansion of Israel's borders, was given a command that felt like a death sentence: go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach against it. Nineveh was the beating heart of the Assyrian Empire, the most brutal war machine the ancient world had ever seen. They were the enemies who would eventually destroy Israel. Jonah did not want them to repent. He wanted them to burn. He fled in the opposite direction, toward Tarshish. The story of the great storm and the great fish is often told as a children's tale, but in the context of the Elijah-Elisha cycle, it is a grim irony. Elijah had commanded the rain. Jonah was nearly drowned by it. Elisha had healed a Syrian leper. Jonah refused to offer healing to the Assyrians. When Jonah finally preached and the entire city of Nineveh repented in sackcloth and ashes, Jonah sat on a hill and sulked. He was the only prophet in history to be angry at his own success. God's response to Jonah echoed the whisper in the cave at Horeb: should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left? As the 8th century BC wore on, the patience of the heavens reached its limit. The house of Jehu, which Elisha had anointed, fell in a bloody mess of assassinations. Kings lasted months, sometimes only weeks. The Assyrian Empire, like a slow-moving glacier of iron and bronze, began to grind toward Samaria. King Hoshea, the last king of Israel, tried to play a dangerous game of international chess, paying tribute to Assyria while secretly plotting an alliance with Egypt. It was a fatal mistake. Shalmaneser V, the king of Assyria, discovered the treachery. He marched his legions across the Galilee and laid siege to the Crown of Pride, the city of Samaria. For 3 years, the city that Elisha had once saved from famine was once again choked of life. This time, there were no 4 lepers to bring good news. There was no prophet to promise flour at the gate. The thin silence was now the silence of a God who had stopped speaking because the people had stopped listening. In 722 BC, the walls of Samaria finally breached. The Assyrians did not just conquer, they erased. Following their brutal policy of calculated frightfulness, they deported the elite, the craftsmen, and the farmers of Israel, scattering them across the vast reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates. In their place, they brought in foreigners from Babylon and cut the people who would eventually intermarry with the remaining Israelites to become the Samaritans of the New Testament. The northern kingdom, the land of Elijah's fire and Elisha's oil, vanished from the map of history. The 10 tribes were lost, not because they disappeared from the earth, but because they lost the one thing that made them a people: their covenant. While the north fell into darkness, a small lamp still flickered in the south, the kingdom of Judah. Under King Hezekiah, Jerusalem prepared for the Assyrian storm. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, fresh from destroying 46 fortified cities of Judah, surrounded Jerusalem. His general, the Rabshakeh, stood outside the walls and mocked the people in their own language. "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you," he shouted. "Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Ivah? Have they delivered Samaria from my hand?" Hezekiah did what his northern cousins had failed to do. He went into the temple and spread the Assyrians' threatening letter before the Lord. The prophet Isaiah, the spiritual heir to the mantle of Elijah, sent word to the king, "He shall not come into this city, for I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake and for my servant David's sake." That night, the angel of the Lord, perhaps the same one who had fed Elijah under the juniper tree, went through the Assyrian camp. In the morning, 185,000 soldiers lay dead. Sennacherib broke camp and retreated to Nineveh, where he was eventually assassinated by his own sons while worshiping in the temple of his god. The story of the Bible's kings and prophets is not a straight line of progress. It is a cycle of fire and ash, of whispers and thunder. The Old Testament ends with a promise that bridges the gap of 400 years of silence. The prophet Malachi writes the final words of the Old Covenant. "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children, and the hearts of the children to their parents." The mantle was not lost. It was waiting for a man in the wilderness eating locusts and wild honey. It was waiting for a voice crying out, "Prepare the way of the Lord." It was waiting for the moment when the still, small voice would take on flesh and dwell among us. The story of Elijah and Elisha teaches us that God is as much in the miracle of the multiplied oil as he is in the tragedy of the falling city. He is the God of the mountain and the God of the valley, the God of the fire and the God of the silence. And even when the kingdom falls and the people are scattered, the word of the Lord, the same word that sustained Elijah by the brook, remains unyielding and eternal. To expand this narrative to the requested scale, we must move beyond the biographical and into the architectural, cultural, and spiritual ecosystem that birthed the prophets. This is the story of the schools of the prophets, the rise of the ivory palaces, and the silent, invisible thread of the 7,000 who never bowed their knees. Part 28. The ivory and the ash. To understand why Elijah's fire was necessary, one must understand the luxury of Samaria. While the peasants struggled with the 3-year drought, King Ahab sat in his ivory house. Archaeological excavations in Samaria have uncovered hundreds of exquisite ivory plaques, intricate carvings of sphinxes, lotus flowers, and lions that once inlaid the furniture and walls of the palace. This wasn't just wealth, it was a statement of defiance. By importing Egyptian motifs and Phoenician craftsmanship, Ahab was signaling that Israel was no longer a people set apart. They were a cosmopolitan power. The conflict on Carmel wasn't just about a name for God, it was a clash of civilizations. Baal was the god of the system, the god of the rain for the crops, the god of the economy, the god of the status quo. To worship Baal was to accept that life was about production and consumption. To worship Yahweh was to accept that life was about covenant and justice. When Elijah stood on the mountain, he was calling the people back from the ivory to the altar. He was reminding them that a nation built on the backs of the poor and the blood of the innocent, like Naboth, could not be sustained by any amount of foreign ivory. Part 29. The Hidden Brotherhood. The schools of the prophets. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Elijah-Elisha saga is the existence of the sons of the prophets. We often think of Elijah as a lone wolf, but he was actually the father of a growing movement of spiritual radicals. These schools were located in strategic spiritual centers. Bethel, the site of Jacob's ladder, now a center of state-sponsored idolatry. Jericho, the city of the fallen walls, a place of new beginnings. Gilgal, where the Israelites first camped after crossing the Jordan. These sons of the prophets were not priests. They didn't work in the temple. They were a counterculture. They lived in communal huts, shared simple meals, sometimes accidentally poisonous ones, as the story of the death in the pot reminds us, and studied the ancient stories of the Exodus. Elisha, more than Elijah, was an administrator of this movement. He was a headmaster of the Spirit. When one of these students lost a borrowed axe head in the Jordan, Elisha didn't tell him it was a small matter. He made the iron swim. Why? Because to a community that had given up everything to follow the truth, even a borrowed tool was a matter of divine concern. Part XXX, the psychology of the prophet. What does it do to a man to carry the voice of God? We see in Elijah a pattern of extreme resilience followed by extreme fragility. After the fire, he ran. This is the post-Carmel collapse. Modern psychology might call it burnout or a dark night of the soul. The Bible is brutally honest about the mental health of its heroes. Elijah wasn't a superhero. He was a man of like passions. The cure for his depression was fourfold. 1. Physical care, sleep and food, the angel's cake. 2. Solitude, the journey to Horeb. 3. Venting. God allowed him to complain twice before answering. 4. Succession. God gave him a friend Elisha so he wouldn't be alone. This humanizes the miraculous. It tells the reader that the double portion isn't about having double the power. It's about having a brother to share the weight of the mantle. Part 31. The geopolitics of the Levant. While the prophets were dealing with spiritual fires, the map of the world was shifting. Israel was caught in a pincer movement between two giants, Aram's Syria to the north and Egypt to the south. The story of Naaman the Syrian is more than a healing story, it is a diplomatic incident. When the king of Israel received the letter asking him to heal Naaman, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God? He is picking a fight with me." Elisha's intervention saved the nation from a war. By healing the enemy general, Elisha was practicing prophetic diplomacy. He was showing the superpower of the day that the God of Israel didn't need an army to command respect. He only needed a muddy river and a surrendered heart. Part 32. The legacy of the chariot. Why a whirlwind? Why a chariot of fire? In the ancient Near East, the storm god Baal was often depicted riding the clouds or a chariot of thunder. By taking Elijah up in a whirlwind and a chariot of fire, God was making a final, definitive claim. The elements belong to me. Every miracle Elijah and Elisha performed was a direct polemic against the gods of the age. Baal controls the rain. Elijah locks the sky. Asherah controls the harvest. Elisha multiplies the grain. Mo, the god of death, is invincible. Elisha raises the boy. The story ends not in a museum, but in the life of the reader. The mantle is the invitation to see the world not as a collection of ivory and ash, but as a theater of divine action. It is the belief that the 7,000 are still out there, men and women who refuse to bow to the idols of their age, waiting for the whisper that changes everything. Final synthesis. The tapestry of the mantle. As we conclude this massive exploration, we see that the 25,000 plus words of history, miracle, and prophecy all point to a singular truth. God is not silent, even when he is quiet. From the jagged heights of Carmel to the quiet banks of the Jordan, the story of the Bible is the story of a God who is God of the hills and God of the valleys. He is the fire that consumes the sacrifice, the oil that fills the jar, and the whisper that heals the soul. The story of the prophet and the whispering silence is the story of humanity's search for meaning in a world of storms. And the answer, as Elijah found in the cave, is never in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. It is in the voice that knows your name and asks, "What are you doing here?" Have you ever felt like you're part of a story much bigger than yourself? A tale woven through time, connecting the past, present, and what's yet to come. Today, we're going on a journey, not across oceans or continents, but through a spiritual landscape, exploring a story of faith, resilience, and ultimate hope. We'll delve into the concept of the silent remnant, map out a geography of grace, and look toward the transition to the eternal. Let's start with the silent remnant. What does that even mean? Throughout history, in every age, there have been individuals and small groups who quietly hold fast to a deeper truth. They're not always the loudest voices in the room, nor do they seek the spotlight. They are the keepers of the flame, the ones who preserve faith when it seems to be fading everywhere else. Think of them as the steady, quiet hum beneath the noise of the world. In times of great turmoil or widespread indifference, these are the people who, through their simple, steadfast belief and quiet actions, ensure that hope and truth are not extinguished. They are the spiritual bedrock, often unseen, but absolutely essential. They pray, they serve, they love, and they endure, forming an unbroken chain of faithfulness that stretches back for millennia. They're not defined by a specific denomination or location, but by a shared heart posture, a commitment to living a life aligned with principles of love, integrity, and devotion, even when it's not popular. They are the quiet heroes of the spiritual narrative. Now, where does this remnant exist? This brings us to our second idea, the geography of grace. This isn't a map you can find on Google. It's a spiritual geography, a landscape of the heart and soul. Grace isn't confined to grand cathedrals or specific holy sites. It can be found in the most unexpected places. It's in the quiet corner of a bustling city park where someone finds a moment of peace. It's in a hospital room where a simple act of kindness brings comfort. It's in the family kitchen, where forgiveness is offered and received over a shared meal. The peaks of this geography are moments of profound spiritual connection, awe, wonder, a deep sense of peace. The valleys might be times of struggle, doubt, or suffering, but even there, grace is present, often in the form of resilience, compassion, and the support of others. This geography of grace is the terrain where the silent remnant lives and moves. It's not a physical kingdom, but a spiritual one, existing wherever a heart is open to it. Every act of kindness, every prayer, every moment of genuine connection adds a new landmark to this sacred map. It's a reminder that holy ground is anywhere we allow it to be. So we have the silent remnant living within this geography of grace. But where is it all leading? This is our final and perhaps most profound concept, the transition to the eternal. This isn't about an end, but a transformation. It's the ultimate hope that underpins the faith of the remnant. The idea is that this life, with all its joys and sorrows, its struggles and triumphs, is not the final chapter. It's a preparation, a journey towards something more. The transition to the eternal is the passage from our limited, time-bound existence into a reality that is timeless, whole, and complete. It's the culmination of the story. For the silent remnant, living faithfully within the geography of grace is the way they prepare for this transition. It's not about earning a ticket to some future paradise, but about cultivating a character and a spirit that is already in harmony with the eternal. It's about learning to live in a way that reflects the values of that ultimate reality: love, peace, joy, and truth right here and now. The transition itself might be a mystery, but the path toward it is clear. Live a life of purpose, compassion, and unwavering faith. It's the belief that every small act of goodness, every moment of quiet devotion, ripples out into eternity. It is the promise that the story doesn't end with the closing of our eyes in this world, but opens into a new, unimaginably beautiful chapter. Let's bring it all together. The story of the silent remnant is a story of endurance. It's about those who hold on to faith when it's easiest to let go. The geography of grace is the world they inhabit, a world where divine kindness can be found anywhere, in any moment, if we only have the eyes to see it. And the transition to the eternal is the grand hope that gives their journey meaning, the promise that all their quiet faithfulness, all their unseen struggles, are leading to a glorious destination. This three-part narrative offers a powerful lens through which to view our own lives. It invites us to ask, am I part of this remnant? Am I actively looking for and creating spaces of grace in my own life and for others? And is my life oriented toward a hope that transcends the here and now? It's a call to live with intention, to find meaning not in the loud and flashy, but in the quiet, steady, and faithful. It's a reminder that even the smallest light, held steadily, can illuminate the path through the darkest of times, leading us all toward a brighter, eternal dawn. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. If this reflection resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content that explores the deeper questions of life and faith. Until next time, take care and keep seeking the grace in your geography.